Good morning, guys. So, yesterday we finished our story part from Seedfolks, but I thought you might find it interesting to come to understand some of Paul Fleischman's process for writing. So, he's got a note at the back of the book called From Seed to Seedfolks. And I'm going to break it in half because it is a little bit lengthy, and I've got to hop on Zoom with you guys in about 15 minutes. So this was the first portion of From Seed to Seedfolks, the story of how Seedfolks came to be. I was sitting in a bagel shop, wondering if I'd ever find an idea for my next book. Flipping through a newspaper while eating, I came to an article that caused me to stop chewing. It was about a local psychologist who used gardening to help her clients. The story mentioned that physicians in ancient Egypt prescribed garden walks for mentally ill patients. My brain began to race. The seed for seed folks had been planted. Books don't usually come from a single source. Like rivers, many tributaries flow into them. Some reach back to childhood, others might be only a few months old. I brought home the newspaper, put the article in my file, and wrote a few notes in my idea notebook. But Seed Folks actually had its start many years before. My parents were both dedicated gardeners. In the summer, in Santa Monica, California, I could pick plums, grapes, oranges, berries, loquats, apricots, figs, and tangerines without leaving my yard. Little by little, my parents had plowed under the lawn in search of more planting space. Our house was the only one in the neighborhood with a cornfield in the front yard. My father, Sid Fleischman, was a writer of children's books as well. For him, gardening offered a recess break from his study, along with the pleasure of growing our own food. Often over dinner, he'd tally up the number of ingredients that had come from our soil. Writers, like gardeners, tend to be self taught and value self sufficiency. I learned to write from my father, but I'm no less a product of my mother, who took her gardening skills into the community. When I was in high school, she volunteered at a therapeutic garden in a veterans hospital, showing men who'd served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam how to raise vegetables and flowers, helping to heal damaged psyches in the process. The example of my mother's volunteerism was powerful. Over the years, she arranged book giveaways in cash poor school districts, used her Spanish speaking skills to tutor students in English, and in her last years learned Braille so as to translate books for the blind. The conflict between my parents' spheres, the printed page, and the wider world, is an ancient one for me. I've solved it by keeping a foot in both. Following my mother's lead, I've tutored learners of English, been a volunteer middle school violin teacher, and delivered library books to shut ins. In an earlier book of mine, a character who's lost her mother vows to keep her alive by becoming her. I found myself doing the same. My own mother died a few years before Seed Folks. She was a large part of the lure of the idea. A book about the healing power of plants would keep her flame lit. Those facts would be transformed into fiction in Kim's opening chapter. I'd heard about community gardens, plots of land, usually in large cities, where anyone can grow food and flowers. Such a setting would offer a more varied cast than a therapeutic garden, people of all ages from every corner of the world. I began researching and felt that exciting magnetism that takes place when I'm planning a book. Newspapers and magazines suddenly seemed filled with references to community gardens. A friend of mine took a job at a local garden for the homeless. Another friend who'd helped found a community garden in Boston made me a tape of reminiscences. I read books. I toured gardens, taking notes. I knew immigration would be central to the book. Seed folks is an old term for ancestors. I'd come across it many years before and written it in my notebook as a possible title. My thought at the time was to collect actual accounts of first generation immigrants to the United States, those who were the founders of their families here. How had they traveled here? What were the first years like? The book had never come to pass, but the title remained on my list and on my mind. Suddenly, I had a book to go with it. Titles are tough. To have an idea that comes ready made with a title is like buying a house that's already furnished. My father's father had emigrated from Russia around 1900. My mother's family had come over centuries earlier. One of her relations had been tried as a witch in Massachusetts. But I wanted my book to be set in the present and to focus on recent immigrants. This led me to choose Cleveland as a setting, a city not as well covered as New York or Chicago, a place famous for its foreign born population in the past and now absorbing immigrants from new quarters of the globe. Famous as well for its harsh white winters, Cleveland would be a place where the sight of green would be especially precious. Not to be forgotten in the decision were a number of friends of mine who lived or had lived there. Can you see Canada across Lake Erie? That's the sort of question that might take days to track down, but that a friend on the phone can answer at once. So that's the first part of this process. Tomorrow we'll finish up and then we will be done with Seedfolks. If you're following along in Fever 1793, chapter 14 is a bit long, so look for that uploaded after 11 o'clock this morning. As always, I love you, I miss you, and I can't wait to see you again. Mwah.